In this presentation, you're going to get some great tips and tricks for when you conduct remote internal audits in your organisation. Hello and welcome to our ongoing series of compliance and business improvement presentations presented by Mango. My name's Craig Thornton and I present these sessions on things all to do with compliance. We will be joined in this presentation by Andrew Thornhill from IRM Systems. He's based out of Melbourne in Australia.
Excellent. Thanks, Craig. Welcome to everyone listening. We appreciate you listening in and I hope everyone's doing okay in difficult times. We'll run through today's kind of content shortly. I'll just introduce this slide here on our blog, IRM Systems blog, and our YouTube page. We've got a whole lot of content around internal audit processes if you were planning and conducting a normal site-based internal audit. So rather than repeat too much of that content today, if you want to brush up on anything, go back and look at some of those kind of videos for you. But today's topic, how do we conduct remote audits? And we'll have a focus on internal audits as we do that. So we'll look at all of these topics here today, why we might need to do remote audits, very brief refresher on, well, why as a business do we conduct internal audits? What's the benefits? It's important to keep that in mind. What's some risk and opportunities around remote auditing in contrast to our normal kind of auditing might be. The next two, people and equipment, are two kind of key areas where we really do need to work through a few issues and make sure we have kind of the right tools and equipment in place and our auditors are comfortable, and then we'll step you through some of the steps involved in remote auditing. Okay, so this is really just coming back to what's the purpose of in any type of internal auditing, whether it's remote or site-based within a business. Just as a bit of a refresher, yes, we audit as a business to verify our processes are implemented as planned, and from an environmental safety perspective that aspects and hazards and risks are managed as planned, as well as, I've got the word outcomes there, that yes, we not only audit the process and procedures, but we want to also make sure the outcome is what we want. Are we providing a safe workplace? Are we managing environmental impacts? Is our product or service meeting customer needs as well? Audits can be really useful in identifying any gaps and improvement opportunities in those kind of areas. Probably the main point here is there's no change in if we now need to look at options for doing remote audits, we're doing it for the same business reasons and the same business benefits. Why remote audit? What's some of the reasons we might do that? Obviously the current situation is a good example, for better or for worse. Where sites are locked down, well, can we continue with our internal audit program? So remote auditing is obviously an option that may allow us to do that, as well as any other site access issues. Yes, if we've got, every business I've ever been to has always got a limited budget for internal audit programs, so they can be cost effective, and one issue we'll talk about a little bit later is, could we get better outcomes from our audit program if we planned and scheduled some critical audits on site but actually used remote auditing and the reduced cost to more frequently audit sites that are geographically dispersed or cost a lot to travel to, or that sites that we, if we're a water body, for example, in a large state like Western Australia or Queensland, if we've got hundreds of sites, well, yes, we might be able to increase the frequency at which we actually visit some of these sites. Another opportunity with remote audits too is to conduct a very responsive audit. So if we've got a site quite some way away from where you as the auditor is based and there's been an incident or safety near misses or performance is dropping away some way, or maybe we could organise a remote audit around the related safe work procedures. Just, it allows you, there's a timeliness, responsiveness benefit there. Starting with planning and preparing for a remote audit. And anyone I've ever done any training with in the past, or if you watch my videos, you'll see even on a normal audit that we are planning where we can visit site, I tend to get on my high horse about this, that planning and preparing for the audit is really the key to a successful audit, one that offers your business real value. And there's a big difference between, if we're planned and prepared, we understand the processes or the safe work procedures we're meant to be auditing, what some of the hazards and risks are, perhaps what some of the related compliance obligations are, and even a little bit about the operational processes and what that team do on site. That's going to be a much more effective audit than turning up and we've got no idea of any of that, you know, the latter case is clearly not going to be an effective audit. So that kind of pre-planning preparedness, getting an understanding of the site and what the team do there and their hazards, etc., is, I would emphasise, more important in a remote audit than when you can actually be on site. Some of the things we need to work through in our planning and preparing for the audit is talking to the auditees about the kind of tools, software systems we want to use to conduct the remote audit, even some of the equipment they have on site. If I'm not going to be able to physically visually observe with my own eyes, well, yes, a little bit more planning around what plant and equipment's on site even. Yes, in terms of our audit planning, we're going to need to know the roles and responsibility and who's doing what on site so we can plan for a remote audit. You've got to do that with a normal audit, but even more important in a remote audit. Arrangements and agreements around information security, even more important again. So if we are, depending on what remote audit methodology and tools we're going to use, well, if, say for example, I'm auditing Craig today, if he's going to send me some documents afterwards, or I'm going to view them via a share screen mechanism, or even if we're going to record a component of the audit, well, what happens with that electronic documentation, and what's the rules around an agreement around information security? Given there's additional technology used, that is definitely worth working through prior to your audit. I put in the word audit objective here too. That's fundamental. For each and every specific audit we do, we should be very clear on what the audit objective is. As an example, to verify storage and handling of chemicals is consistent with the safe work procedure, the related safe work procedure, something like that. Now, what I'm trying to emphasise here, on a normal audit, it's important to be clear on that. In a remote audit, it's even more important and probably worth asking yourself in consultation with the auditees, well, if that's our objective, is it actually achievable via a remote audit methods? Because yes, there can be obviously some limitations, or the remote audit objective may influence what kind of tools and software and equipment you attempt to use in your remote audit as well. The second dot point there, a physical audit plan, the kind of document we send to the auditees ahead of time, even on a normal audit, I really think is more critical than normal, given we can't be in the same room as the auditees. You know, we need to be very, very clear about what audit criteria or requirements. So what are we actually auditing against on the day? By personnel, so who do we need to interview? When do they need to be available? Even in a normal audit, those last 2 points are important. But yes, if I really need to speak to the maintenance manager on a remote audit at 11 a.m, I need to make sure all parties are very clear. One thing I do emphasise in even audit training for normal audits is actually the auditor's responsibility to keep things on time as well. If prior to 11 a.m, when I need to audit the maintenance manager, I've got a verbose auditee or somebody goes off track, I need to manage that and make sure that I'm ready for that next appointment. As in remote audits, if someone's sitting there waiting for you to kind of log into the system and start connecting with them and nothing's happening, they may well just assume, well, nothing's happening, and the audit can fall over very easily at that point. Even in your audit plan, be clear about what activities you might need to observe, more so than on a normal audit, what documentation, evidence or records you might need to see. So organisations, when it's a normal audit, have different approaches. Some like to say, well, when I come to site, I'm going to need to see the safe work procedures, the environmental plan. I'm going to need to see your records of, your site safety walks, and tend to coach their auditees on what they might need to see on a normal audit. Others don't, and that's a bit of a choice. You may just hope they can produce that evidence on the day. I think there's an argument with the remote audit to perhaps be a little bit clearer about, what evidence you need to see and give them a chance to pre-prepare it beforehand. Last question's important too, is even prior to the audit, some kind of agreement with the main contact person from the auditee's perspective. Well, if we can't view some of the information and evidence, or we can't interview someone we wanted to interview, well, how can we address that and deal with that after the audit? If that information can't be shared remotely or as we planned, what are we going to do in that case? A little bit of contingency planning, essentially. So just going to move on. Looking at the risks and opportunities with remote auditing as approach to auditing, and I'm sure people could add to these slides here with some suggestions as well. Some of the guidance documents around remote auditing. It is a topic touched on in ISO 19011, the guidelines for management system auditing, and certainly the approach the certification bodies are looking at around remote audits too is to say, well, we need to be clear on our audit objective, look at the risks and opportunities to that objective, and if the risks are manageable, then yes, remote auditing, let's proceed with our plans to conduct the audit remotely. So some of the risks, some of the things that could be more difficult to manage or impact on our audit objective is, yes, obviously via remote audit. Here's just some suggestions. You can just read them there, but obviously communication is slightly more difficult than when we're face-to-face. There is some risk, even in a face-to-face side audit, but that certainly in a remote audit, that auditees deliberately direct you away from or choose not to show you something that perhaps you could observe if you were on site. Yes, that is a bit of a risk. The last one there, these are just some basic suggestions. There's a lot more. But yeah, auditees, I mean, audits can make auditees a little bit threatened or uncomfortable at times. If there's an extra layer over that where they're not that familiar or comfortable with remote interaction technologies, then that could just add to that. I'm sure as a group we could build a big list up there of both the risks and opportunities. Some of the opportunities I think I've already touched on. Yes, reduce cost or to cover more sites, or even perhaps interview more people if we are certainly organisations that are national or have quite dispersed, geographically dispersed sites. You can probably get better outcomes across your audit program by looking at, for the same cost, by looking at remote audit means. It certainly should be something they are considering. So I'm just coming back to a couple of key issues around the remote audit process. And the first one I have touched on just a moment ago. Yes, one of the things we always emphasise in our internal audit training is to manage people, communicate effectively, because auditees can be a bit nervous or threatened by the process. I'm sure we've all been in that situation where we're both the auditor, but then when we're the auditee and someone suddenly, you might be really comfortable with what your job is and how you do it and how well you're performing, but as soon as someone says it's an audit, it can make people a little bit nervous, if you like. We always advocate in auditor training is, take time to put people at ease. Break the ice. Other techniques for putting people at ease, you can look back at the video. We've got some videos on our YouTube page about that, but simple things, re-explaining the objective. We're out here to audit the system and the processes, not to find fault with people, letting them know how audit findings are dealt with, that it's not the end of the world, or you don't lose your operating licence to get a non-conformance. Things like that can help if auditees understand the process, they tend to get a little bit more comfortable with it. The middle dot point's quite interesting and important because I have seen very, very skilled auditors who've got really good perceptive kind of people skills. It's really saying the second point is really saying most people don't stick up their hand and say, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Auditor, I'm really nervous and uncomfortable. They tend to show it through their non-verbal communication. And that's where a skilled auditor, if they start to get a bit of a gut feel that this person's not that comfortable, without being over the top, take some preemptive steps to just try and reinforce what we're doing and make the auditees more comfortable as well. Again, look at the videos for some additional strategies around there. As well as the second part of that second dot point is quite important. Yes, there is potential for given we're conducting this audit remotely, the auditees can't just ask you to clarify something face-to-face. We're using remote audit technologies. Yes, that could increase their unease if we're not careful. So we need to plan and prepare, have some strategies around that, take a little bit more time to communicate the audit objective and what we're doing and why we're doing it, basically. Okay, I think that's a really important point. Now, equipment, yes, is really important. From having a discussion with Craig shortly prior to the webinar, I mean, one personal reflection is I do see organisations and people within the organisations are perhaps more comfortable and familiar with the kind of webinar technologies, screen sharing technologies, things like that than they were 3, 4, 5 years ago. I had just on Wednesday completed a remote audit with a engineering consultancy that's got offices all around Australia. It went very, very smoothly. The project managers just speaking to different project managers at different times, they were all very comfortable with the technology. That point I made earlier about time management, even leaving a break between what you don't want to be trying to sign off with one project manager at 10:29 and then trying to log in and be speaking to the next project manager at 10:30. You need a bit more of a gap than normal. But the point I'm trying to make is, yeah, people are seem to be more comfortable, at least anecdotally, with some of the technology. That same company I tried to audit remotely about 3 or 4 years ago, and it got cancelled after 5 minutes because they just couldn't get it going at their end. Okay, so yes, really important point around planning for our remote audit, and by equipment I mean the tools and the software, the video cameras, whatever you think we need to use. We need to plan that out carefully. So what tools do we need, and test them at both ends. There's nothing worse than we've scheduled this 10:30 appointment with the maintenance manager, and one of the, the auditor or the maintenance manager can't get the, web conferencing software we're trying to use working. It really does kill the audit straight away. So yes, I think the first 2 dot points come in there. What tools are we going to use? Let's test them at both ends is really important, and let's make sure there's user training. We can't just, if someone's managing a water treatment plant and use of this technology is not their kind of core skill set, well, we need some user training if this audit is going to be effective. Now, in our normal audits, we really encourage, if you want to I'll emphasise the importance of planning and preparedness, and part of that is getting an understanding of the criteria or the requirements you're auditing. And even prior to the audit, really good auditors start to work their way through and say, well, what type of evidence might be available to demonstrate conformance to that criteria? So if it's a chemical storage procedure, or if it's an audit against ISO 45001, what kind of evidence might the auditee have for a specific requirement? For example, for action on risk and opportunities as one example. By thinking that through, we can then start to say, well, what's going to be, so a standard forms of evidence we're looking for is either interviewing people, making observations, or looking through documents and records are our key sources of audit evidence or objective evidence in any type of audit. And what we're really saying is the 3rd dot point, that kind of pre-planning, what evidence might be available to meet this requirement or demonstrate this requirement, and how might, if that's the type of evidence that's available, to give you a practical example, under 45001, if there's a requirement in the planning clause that planning section around identification of hazards and risks, or what might be the typical output. And as a next step for really good planning, and it's more important, is, well, what remote auditing technology would we use, or did the auditees have that would enable them to demonstrate that? So it might be screen sharing, for example, or maybe they could demonstrate it just by interview. Or do we need to use a video or a webcam so we can actually see things as well? Okay, that kind of step is a high level of audit planning, but I can't emphasise enough that in remote audits, it's even more important. You don't want to suddenly move on to the next requirement in your procedure and they haven't got any way of demonstrating it to you through the technology. That's what we're trying to avoid. Yes, we want to confirm, we don't want to just assume that they've got access to a webcam or any of this technology. We need to double check that. Internet reliability, yes, particularly at remote sites. We just want to double check that, not make assumptions. One thing I've noticed this week, I've done 2 remote audits. I mentioned one with that engineering consultancy and another one was with an infrastructure provider. Yes, they both had reasonable internet coverage, but given the demand on the internet at the moment, when they went to go into their web conferencing software, they were having a few issues with that infrastructure provider, but they finally got there. So it wasn't quite as reliable. There's high demand at the moment, obviously. Yep. The next point's really making sure we have that information security access rights, and not to just, not to just plug Mango, but those kind of software options are quite good in that you can create a access profile for your auditor and limit what they need to see. The last dot point, yes, really important. I have given the example of chemical storage and handling. If that's the safe work procedure, we need to audit. And we want to move on from just seeing records and documentary evidence. We probably need to go and view some of those chemical storage areas and see how things are actually stored. What is the outcome? Are they stored properly? Is anything leaking, etc., etc.? Now, this probably comes back to our audit planning, but if we do need to view operational areas, we're obviously going to have to think about what equipment and technology we're going to use to achieve that. To get all of those things above applied, should be tested, etc., etc. Now, with the audit process itself, I'll step you through a remote audit process, but just some of our standard auditing approaches, if anything, we need to be a little bit more formal. Our audit planning and audit plan, I've already mentioned, I won't go back through those, but some of our formalities, which you can be relatively informal on a site audit when you already know everyone, you're auditing the team you work with, etc. Well, in a remote audit, we probably need to go the other way, be a little bit more formal about things like formal communication opportunities, opening and closing meetings, clear timeframes and breaks, things like that. A site tour, yes, personally I tend to, particularly for environment safety, even quality audits, ask for a bit of a site tour if I am on site doing an audit fairly early on in the process. They're very valuable. You can see some of what's happening well or not so well and what plant and equipment's being used and who's on site, things like that. Again, still good practice in a remote audit, but yes, work out through what means are you going to do that. Yes, really emphasising the communication there on the last point is, yes, if we're working as part of an audit team, we need to communicate, update each other more regularly than a normal audit in a remote audit. As well as, yes, when I do site audits, I tend to, you want to debrief auditees, let them know how everything's going. They'll be interested in that. Well, we do probably more of that. And also with our key contact person on site, if we have that arrangement where we say, if there's any actionable findings, we'll raise them with perhaps the safety manager in the first instance and then communicate it to them. I think those formal communication channels with a key contact are more important in a remote audit. Okay. Now, some things about the remote audit process itself. One of our videos on our YouTube page is about what kind of questions can you ask in an audit. Different styles of questions can be used when we're interviewing people to both put the auditees at ease, but also to uncover the information and evidence that we need to see. One of those question types was, or two of them were reflective and clarifying questions. Now, in a remote audit, because we're not in the same room as the auditees, they're really more important than normal. Now, the purpose of a reflective or clarifying question is to really start our next question with a statement that reconfirms what we've heard in the auditee's response to the previous question. Now, auditees really like these questions because if Craig is interviewing me now, it signals to me that, oh yes, Craig understands what I've just told him. Particularly around, it's a way of building, I guess, confidence within the auditees that you are treating their information appropriately and you understand it. So if Craig's just given me a response around something that's really critical, that's in a normal audit, a good time to ask a reflective or clarifying question to say, well, Craig, let me see if I understand. When you inspect the incoming goods, you check X and Y and Z, and then it needs to be signed off by the warehouse manager. And then I go into my new question. It also gives the auditees a chance to say, well, hang on, Andrew, you haven't, no, we don't always check X, Y, and Z. Some days we need to apply a different checklist instead. So it allows them to, shows them you're listening, it shows them your understanding, and at critical points, it gives them the opportunity to confirm that you understand things correctly. So, yeah, the big tip is there. I would probably ask a few more of those than in a normal audit. Yes, take extra time to confirm and communicate findings and any action required, particularly if there's any non-conformance findings. There's always a risk in a normal audit that we go back and the auditees say, oh, I didn't realise we had to take action on that. Obviously, there's an increased chance of that during a remote audit. A tip for remote audits in the next dot point is when you're writing your report, be a little bit clearer about, well, what was the evidence? Who were you interviewing? what was the document or record or email that demonstrated conformance or non-conformance. It's not a bad way to write an audit report anyway, but yes, in a remote audit, I think there's an argument to say it's important to be a little bit clearer, because that audit report becomes your key record of the audit immediately and into the future as well. So if Craig's got to conduct the same audit in 12 months' time and there's nothing recorded about how I determine conformance or non-conformance, it's going to be more difficult. Okay. One really important point too, and I have seen some misunderstanding here where I say, well, it's a non-conformance because the auditees couldn't demonstrate that they've got their SECI data sheet, something like that. If the underlying reason is because of a failure of the remote auditing tools, that really shouldn't be an NCR. You've got two choices. I think it's better to actually state, well, couldn't determine conformance or non-conformance with this requirement because of this reason, or to ask them to send you additional evidence after the audit. We can't really blame a failure of the remote auditing tools as a reason for why they couldn't demonstrate conformance, because perhaps they could have if those tools were working properly. Now we're going to move on to Q&A shortly. I just wanted to highlight that yes, ISO 9011, which is a guidance standard, it can't be audited against or anything like that. Not a bad standard. A lot of the internal auditor training you can do out there with the different certification bodies is based on that, and even lead auditor training is based on that anyway. But yes, for your reference, that does have some guidance around remote audits. I'm also just referring there to a recent blog by John Watt, who's one of the Mango partners in Christchurch. Very recent one, and particularly his tips around people and equipment are worth having a look at if, it's really re-emphasising what we're talking about today.
Thanks, Andrew. That's fantastic. That's you've packed in a lot of stuff there in 30 minutes. Brilliant. If you enjoyed this video, why not click on this link here and enjoy some more of Andrew's internal auditor training.